All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you spending a little time with us this afternoon for a very special seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffat, and I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University, and I will be one of the hosts for this event. I'll hand the mic off to our second host in a second, but I just want to do a reminder that this is a hybrid event, so that means we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks online, we ask that you put any questions you might have into the chat box. Either technical questions or any issue or any questions for our speaker. Our volunteer Roseanne will read those out and make sure that us in the room can hear those questions and our speaker can answer them. For folks in the room, when we get to the question and answer section, if you raise your hand, Lisa and I will run around with mics and make sure that you can ask your questions so folks online can hear. But again, thank you so much for being here. If you are new to our seminar series and you're in the room, I also ask that you sign up on the form outside. That does a couple things for us. It helps us keep track of our outreach numbers, but it also justifies us buying cookie and coffee. So if you can sign up for that, that would be great. Okay, couple of really quick announcements before we get started. I just wanted to say that we are already going to be starting June seminars next week. I can't believe it. But seminar next week on June 6th will be Molly Keogh. She is an NSF postdoc with CEOS at Oregon State University, and we'll be talking about polar mud on the move, exploring tools we use to track in the Arctic and Antarctic sedimentation that will illuminate how climate change is impacting polar coastlines. So that should be a really interesting talk. And so I'm hoping that you all can join us next week, same place, same time. But for today, again, I was saying that today's speaker was invited by our student group, HSO, and this is the 5th year of our student invited speaker series. This is an extra special seminar series because our students are the host, they pick the speaker, and they basically run the show. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Lisa, who is going to introduce herself really quickly and talk about this process a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Cinnamon. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Hildebrandt. I'm one of 2 co-presidents for the Hatfield Student Organization, and we're very grateful to the Director's Office for once a year sponsoring a speaker of our choice to come to Hatfield. And not only do they give a speaker, but they also give up a lot of their time to meet with students and other members of the Hatfield community if they're interested in one-on-one meetings. So it's a really cool way for us to bring scientists from, around the country that we think are awesome and to interact with and learn from them. So the way it works is we have student members are allowed to nominate a speaker. It can be anyone that they find interesting in their research field. And then the Hatfield student membership votes, and based on, sometimes it has to be rank based, but based on, whoever our top scorer is, then gets invited. And we hope that they accept, which Leslie did. And yeah, we do that once a year, and we're very grateful to the Director's Office for the support.
And we are also very grateful for our HSO student group and all the work that they do. This is not easy to host somebody and figure out how to deal with all the logistics. And I don't know Leslie well, but yeah, sometimes it can be difficult. But I'm going to hand the mic back to Lisa to introduce today's speaker.
Okay, I'm so excited and honored to introduce Dr. Leslie New. Full disclosure, I nominated Leslie this year, and I didn't rake the votes, even though I am one of 2 co-presidents. She did get the most votes, but Dr. Leslie New graduated from Cornell University with a bachelor's in natural resources in 2003, and then from the University of St. Andrews with a PhD in statistics and biology in 2010. She remained at St. Andrews as a postdoctoral fellow before continuing her research with the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission and the U.S. Geological Survey at, I didn't ask you, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. She was tenured in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at Washington State University, Vancouver, before moving to her current post as an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics, Computer Science, and Statistics at Ursinus College. Her research focuses on statistical ecology, including the practical application of hierarchical Bayesian state space models, understanding and mitigating human-wildlife conflict, and quantitatively assessing the population consequences of disturbance. Dr. New is particularly interested in the quantification, incorporation, and propagation of uncertainty in statistical models used for management and conservation decisions, and how to incorporate Star Wars into teaching and research. I have the absolute privilege of working with Leslie through a project that I do for my PhD, that I'm a part of for my PhD. Leslie is one of many co-PIs on it, and I've learned so much from Leslie. She is incredibly generous with her time and her wisdom. She's personable, and I think one of the best people that has made statistics approachable to me. So I'm really excited that she's here and that you all get to listen to her speak and learn from her. And yeah, take it away, Leslie.
All right, so as you can tell from the title, I am a bit of a Star Wars fan. And I have gone on really deep dives. So I will warn you, there is a lot of Star Wars references in this. I couldn't help myself. So like many of you here in this room, there we go. I started out back in undergrad with dreams of being a conservationist, of being an ecologist. And I imagined this exciting life in the field of going to exotic places, and was really, really excited and really looking forward to it. And I love science, but I hated maths, so the answer was ecology, right? Like that is why I was doing this. I mean, not completely, but that was a large part of it. And I started, and it was great, right? I got to do field biology. I got to study pure biology, environment. The management bit, I will admit, I had some problems with. I was like, oh, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk to each other. We're going to listen to one another. And I was like, just do something, please. But it was there. And I was like, okay, I get it. But there was these whispers, right? I was required to take mathematics. I was required to take statistics. And I had no idea why. Right? It was required. I had to do it. I actually convinced my undergraduate supervisor to let me count statistics as one of my 2 required math classes. I'm still not sure why he let me get away with it, but he did. Right? But it was just like, I have to do it. I'm just going to tick that box. And some of what I've learned over the years is that there's what I think of as the course wars, right? That ecology does have a lot of statistics and mathematics in it, but the folks who are on the kind of pure ecology side sit there and say, what is ecology? It's organisms in the environment. And we can't have more requirements. If our major is too overloaded, students aren't going to take it. And they're scared of math because we all were too. We don't want to go there. And folks like me who are now on the quantitative side sit there and say, it's an integral part, right? We're leaving a gap in our undergraduate students' knowledge if we don't give them this training. And so we really should. It's important skill sets, right? Like as you see up there, some of you might consider it to be unnatural, but it's still needed. And not literally, this was going more for the dark side reference, right? Weed out the weak, right? If they can't handle it, then, right, there's other things that people can do. Maybe you become more policy oriented, but if you're going to do the research side, right, the maths are important. And what happens though, is that research in ecology does truly require quantitative reasoning. This is statistics, it's mathematics, it's computer science, right? It's all in there. But as a graduate student, and I don't have this experience, this is my experience as somebody who is working at an institution that had a large biology and ecology department. I was hired specifically to teach those students statistics, and this is kind of what I saw. They'd get 1 intro course from me, have almost nothing from undergraduate, and then just be expected to go off and do complex statistics as part of their master's or PhD project, right? And so they'd be straight into the fire, and they hated it, right? It was like deeply, deeply awful because all you have is like, I learned to do a t-test and that p-values mean statistical significance. And now I have to do Bayesian hierarchical modeling. And it's awful, right? And it feeds kind of the fear that comes, the imposter syndrome, which is just inherent in academia, right? It feeds this idea of like, why didn't they prepare me? I paid a ridiculous amount of money for my undergraduate. Like, why did all of this happen? And it leads to, I think, this disgust that comes with ecology. We don't want that comes with ecology, that comes with ecologists often feel towards statistics, right? You're thrown into it. There's no preparation. You don't like it because it's a bad first experience. And what I would argue is that it's simply a different skill set, right? There's many, many, many specialist skill sets that exist within ecology, right? I've listed GIS, ArcGIS, GPS, scuba diving, echo sounder work. There's all of these skills, genetics. There's so much that we need, the specialist fields for field training. I think we're learning about drones and flying and driving boats. And statistics is just another one of these skills that we are all capable of learning. And it binds us all together, right? All of the different projects at some point need some level of analysis. The days where as ecologists, we can go observe something and report on this cool new observation are kind of past us. And so we need something to help us. And statistics is that. And statistics needs context. Unless I want to be someone who is a pure theoretician, I'm doing everything in a setting that I want to be applied. And so this is where we get that integration with ecology and this realization that statistics, like everything, needs to be just more than memorization, right? Y'all can't be researchers if all you're doing is memorizing biological facts. And I do firmly, firmly believe that no one is incapable of learning this skill. I'm living proof, as I said, shameless plug, see my TED Talk. I have an entire TED Talk on it, TEDx Ursinus, you can Google it. But the short part of it is that I was in remedial math until college, right? I was so bad that my elementary school couldn't handle it. And there was a woman who came around with an RV where the back of it had been outfitted to be a classroom. It was the math truck. Instead of going to gym 2 times a week, I went to the math truck because that's how bad I was. And yet I have a PhD in statistics. It was my primary school, right? So yeah. So it's doable, right? Like if I can be that bad and get to this point, it is 100% doable. Nobody gets to tell me that their brain just doesn't work math. But, right, it does come back and bite us a little bit in that statistics is its own field of research, right? So as much as I say, okay, we need to integrate it, there's a lot of general methodologies. That is what we tend to learn in those introductory classes, right? Regression, multivariate statistics, as we get into particularly fisheries, time series, the Markov models. And then with ecology, right, we then have all these specialist methods, right? We have ways to estimate animal abundance. We have ways to assess population viability, right? The current work we're doing, there's a lot of bioenergetics, and there's a ton out there. And so, all right, maybe you're convinced that this is a useful skill, but do you need a full separate degree, right? It's not an easy thing to necessarily bring them all together, despite the fact that I believe that it's possible. And one of the things that's really important to me in all of this is that the ecology is required. The knowledge is required, right? I'm building models that are reflections of reality. One of my favorite statistical sayings is that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? My model is going to be really wrong if I don't speak to an ecologist, if I don't speak to the biologist who I'm collaborating with. And I don't know necessarily what research questions are worth asking. One of the things I often like to talk about with my particularly biology students who are taking my Stat 1 class, why do I need to be here? I want to go and study whales. And I point out that I've never taken a single marine biology class in my entire life, right? And I've studied gray whales and blue whales and right whales and beaked whales and all of these things that I've never had a single class on. And it's not because I'm an expert in marine biology, it's because I work with experts in marine biology, right? And so that is really an important context of working statistics into the field. And a really good example of this is actually one of the first projects I worked on after, actually my first marine mammal project ever, which was on elephant seals. So what we were doing was trying to estimate the lipid mass of a female elephant seal while she was at sea. And this plot that we see up here is that estimation of one of the females. She leaves the beach after fasting, and that's day 0. And then she goes off and she eats food and her lipid mass changes and increases. We had no idea when we started this project if anything like this was going to be possible, right? I managed to get numbers, right? There's bars of uncertainty. It was really, really exciting. I showed it to the biologists. They're looking at we have different females. They're looking at different patterns and they're going, oh, we think this one's going to the Ross Sea and that one's going out to the seamount. And then one of them went, wait a minute, what's going on the y-axis there? And I explain, they go, what's the maximum, kilos that are the weight is changing by day? And I go, oh, around 50 to 60 kilos at max. And they went, no, right? They're like, elephants feel fast on land. We measure them. The most weight we've ever seen an elephant seal lose in one day is 14 kilos. Right? And I was like, these are animals that the females are 800 kilos, the males are over 1,000 kilos. Like 60 kilos didn't seem like a bad idea to me. Wait, what do I know? They were just like, no, stop right there. And it was a problem with the model. If I wasn't working with the ecologists, I probably would have tried to publish that and probably been laughed out of the journal, right? It's just not possible. Or, right, it gets published and then people go, what the hell are you doing? Publishing this thing that's not anchored in the biological knowledge. So they really do have to come together. For me, myself, right, how did I get to the point where I am now? I had a teacher by the name of Evan Cooch. He does a lot of work with birds, who taught a course called Wildlife Population Assessment. I thought it was very cleverly named because you don't realize that it's not about going out into the woods and assessing the quality of populations. Also had some marker capture, and I really got interested in how applicable it was, right? I really saw that this was something that was usable. And I liked, as I said, the practicality. It was very tangible to me. I had gotten tired of the management classes. I'd gotten really tired about how I was going to have to listen to everyone and hear everyone's different sides and just get used to it and work it all together. Like, I get it, it's really important, but I was like, this is not my personality. And so this was something where I was like, I can give you numbers, right? I can give you something that felt like science to me. And the other thing I began to see, because I didn't go straight from my undergrad to PhD, I worked a whole bunch of crazy different jobs in between, is that it made me very employable, right? This interest in wanting to do statistics as applied to ecology opened up doors. I mean, and again, I'm not saying that everybody has to be a statistician. There's lots of other skills that do this. But for me, this is kind of what pushed it over the edge. And as I've gotten more into it, what I've seen as well from a statistics point of view is that the best data in ecology is often really bad in other places, right? That economists would look at some of the data we collect and go, no, why would you ever try to analyze this? And we go, because we spent a couple $1 million and it's the best that's possible, right? And so you want to learn from it. And that, to me, has a lot of value, right? Nobody here is doing bad research, but from a pure statistics point of view, right, your sample size is supposed to be at least 50. And you just can't, like the whales don't help. The fish are hard to see, they're under the water. Like all of this, it makes it really difficult. And so my willingness and desire to integrate the two also helps make a difference. And that's a lot of what I wanted out of my work from the very beginning. I started off thinking of myself as like a park ranger, where I was going to maintain trails and conserve animals. And I'm just approaching it from a different way. None of this, of course, means that it's the end of ecology, right? I actually see it as a new beginning, right? It's a place to think about how can we move forward, right? Particularly technology as a whole, right? Computers get faster, methodologies change, technology grows. How do we grow with it and create a better field? And how do we maintain the balance? I can't do any of my work without y'all, right? It's just not possible. I can't replace ecology. That's not what statistics should be doing, right? It should be helping us to better understand ecology. And so in terms of what statistical ecology is, right, to go with my ongoing Star Wars theme, it's this merging of the light side and the dark, right? Statistics can be used to address the needs of the ecological community, to help answer ecological questions, and to really integrate the statistics into conservation management and policy. And where I think this comes to play is that a lot of times these things have personal viewpoints, right? There's a social context to these decisions. And statistics allows us to say, okay, here's an analysis. I can't tell you if it's important. I can't tell you if, right? I can tell you that I think the population's going to decline. Do we care? That's a social question, right? But I can give you something that maybe people won't argue over quite as much because it came from numbers and from statistics. And we're going to look at 3 case studies to really help show where this comes from. And so all of these are ones that I've worked on. We're going to start with the population consequences of disturbance framework, which is known as PCOD. I'm going to talk about wind-wildlife interactions, and lastly, some animal movement. And there's lots of people here in the audience who have worked on various components or are, in fact, the first authors on some of these projects. So with PCOD, the idea is that individuals are exposed to stressors, right? And these can be anthropogenic disturbance, these can come from the environment, but they are something that stresses us. And that once we're exposed to these stressors, we have responses to it, right? Our behavior may change, we may get stressed, right? These things, if they occur over and over again, affect our health. And if our health is affected enough, right, our vital rates also get impacted. So the analogy I like to use is that if you all are sitting in the lunchroom and somebody comes up and pokes you in the shoulder, right, you get annoyed. Somebody pokes you long enough in the shoulder and you get up and you walk away. And maybe you don't finish your lunch. And if it happens once, it's not really a very big deal, right? We can all go with missing a meal sometimes. But if it happens every day, you're not eating lunch, you probably begin to lose weight. And again, maybe that's okay, but you get stressed, you get more anxious. And if this is happening often enough and with enough meals, right, maybe that weight loss begins to affect other aspects of what we want to do with our life. It's probably as humans not going to affect our survival right away, but certainly starvation is a thing humans can face. But maybe as a woman, I don't end up, reproducing, right? Again, pushing it further. If it's just me, so what? Right? We're a large population, only one individual affected, doesn't really matter. But as more and more individuals in the population get impacted, then the dynamics may change. So that's the idea. And here, right, each of the lines can actually be a mathematical or statistical model, right? So we're going to use math to connect the different components. And this project has been, as I said, this was my first postdoc started in 2010, so it's been quite a while now. And we started by looking at 4 species, so elephant seals, bottlenose dolphins, North Atlantic right whales, and beaked whales. And the idea was that elephant seals and bottlenose dolphins, we're not actually worried about disturbances for the most part, but we know a lot about them. And so we have a lot of data, we can see what's possible. The North Atlantic right whales, the beaked whales, a lot more interested about human impacts, but the data are a little bit more difficult. And so that was kind of how we were going to approach it. And we used different tools to help us understand them. So we used what's known as state space modeling, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. Leslie and Lefkovich matrices, which some people may be familiar with, but this idea of matrix population modeling. I either say that my population has an age structure or a stage structure and use that to assess what might happen. IBMs stand for individual-based models. And so here, if any of you are gamers and you think about, like you're working in a game and you have a character and it goes through and experiences life and builds cities and does all these things, that's basically what individual-based models are. We just do it for entire population. And then bioenergetics models. So again, modeling the energetics of species. And then as that developed, as that was successful, we've added more species to it in our newest iteration. And so here, this includes species like blue whales, gray whales, which we're working on here, harbor porpoise, killer whales, and others as well, right? These are just kind of the ones that I'm familiar with, not necessarily worked on, but most familiar with. And again, right, there's tools that we've used. And so a lot of them are the ones that I have above. We've also added SDP, which stands for Stochastic Dynamic Programming. But so I have this slide here to really show that all of these come with some sort of statistical approach to help us address that framework that I showed on the previous slide. I'm going to talk more about the elephant seals. So that story about me getting the biology horribly wrong, we fixed it, right? We figured out what the problem was. It had to do with the model. We addressed it, and we were able to create one where the maximum weight gain or loss fit within the realm of biological plausibility. So once we had that, what we were interested in doing was saying, if we disturb a female, what happens to her weight? So first plot on your left is if we don't disturb a female, what's her maternal mass when she comes back to shore? And the reason we care about this is because the mother's mass had a strong correlation with the pup's mass, and the pup's mass had a strong correlation with the pup's survival. So if the mother is disturbed and weighs less, her pup will weigh less, And up to a point, it will affect the pup's survival. It will go down. So how much disturbance needs to happen before we begin to see an influence on the pup and an influence on the survival? And so our middle plot is pup mass, and the rightmost plot is the survival. And one of the things you can say is that the uncertainty grows, right? As we go through these different steps, we get more uncertain, but there's a change here, right? Less mass from the mother means less mass for the pup, means in general lower survival as well. And so this was fit using the state space models. And then with the matrix models, we said, all right, here's, again, lots of math going on behind the scenes. But if we disturb a female for 50% of her average trip length, then we're going to see a just shy of 10% decrease in her mass, which is going to lead to a just shy of 2% decrease in the pup's mass, and therefore a decline in survival, and therefore in species abundance. And if this same disturbance were to happen every year for 30 years, we get a 10% decline. Now, do we think that this sort of disturbance is going to happen every year for 30 years? No. The idea of this project very much was seeing, can we go from that individual to the population level effect at all? Right? We didn't know if it was possible, and so we wanted to show that it could happen. A more recent example is with blue whales on this coast. And so here we had lots of different data that we could pull in. We had tag data, right? Where are the whales going? We had information on prey density, how much krill was there. We estimated the dose response functions, right? So as we expose the animals to more noise, what do we expect the response to be? We looked at it as a function of distance as well. So the farther away you are from the noise, the less likely you are to respond. And then we're able to look at a cost potentially of lost feeding, right? So I need a certain amount of energy to keep my body going. I'm going to assume that as an animal, I generally get that energy. But if I'm disturbed, I run the chance of missing it. And so if I look at the plot again on your right, basically this is saying as the disturbance length increases, so that's what's going from left to right along the x-axis, and as the, I think it's the frequency increases, sorry, I'm very bad at acoustics, increases, right, there's a greater disturbance. And so if the disturbance isn't very long, it doesn't matter how loud it is, there's not too much of an effect. But as the disturbance period gets longer and gets louder, right, we run into these situations where we'd actually expect almost all of the energy acquisition to be lost. And we didn't take this one further than this. We didn't connect it later to the population consequences. But again, it's that idea, how did we get from tags of an animal location to estimates of energy lost, right? It was mathematics, it was statistics. I only have one equation in the entire talk. I kept it very light on that end. All right, so that's the PCOD models. Keep doing the wrong button. Something else that I work on is wind and wildlife. So birds and bats collide with operating wind turbines, and this is a problem, right? We don't actually know that much about the behavior of many birds and bats around wind turbines. So that's a limitation. We don't know a lot about what makes a turbine dangerous other than it's spinning, right? So we don't have the answers to these things. And the conflict is that we value renewable energy, right? We want to move away from the non-renewables, but we also value species persistence. And so how do we balance these two things, right? There's no free lunch. And so how do we try and make sure, in my mind, basically, that wind isn't like, hydroelectric is now, where it's 30 years since many of the dams were put in, and we're now trying to spend millions to keep species alive. We'd like to avoid that. And so one way to address this problem is to think about, where do we put the wind farm, right? If we put the wind farm where there's not a lot of birds or bats that we care about, right, we don't have a problem, they're not going to collide. Now, one of the problems with things like eagles that we see in this picture is that they soar, and so they use strong updrafts, and those strong updrafts are often really good places for wind farms. So we have a natural conflict that's occurring. But there may be spots that we can avoid. And then the turbines as well, if we can understand what makes a specific kind of microhabitat dangerous, then we can avoid putting a turbine there, and again, reduce the number of collisions. We can alter how we operate turbines, right? The speed at which they run, the frequency with which they run, the systems, all of these things. And then we can also model it, right? So we can say, how dangerous do we think this particular wind farm or this particular turbine is going to be? And then require mitigation, right? So we don't just kill them, we try and protect them elsewhere. And this is exactly what happens with eagles and wind in the United States. So bald and golden eagles are protected under what are known as the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. That's the first one, affectionately known as BGEPA when we talk about it in short, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And under these acts, you're basically actually not allowed to like breathe on an eagle without federal permission. The bald eagle is actually under stricter protections under the Bald and Gold Eagle Protection Act than it was under the Endangered Species Act. It's very, very, very strict. But wind farms are an otherwise legal activity. So wind farms kill eagles, but they are legal. But because they've killed an eagle, they've broken the law. And the Fish and Wildlife Service response to this has been put in place basically a permitting program that says under certain circumstances, we will allow eagles to be taken, that's the legal term, provided we've mitigated those harmful impacts, right? So there's this idea of balancing development against the need for renewable energy. And so the Eagle Conservation Plan Guidance lays this out. It's based on a statistical model. That's the one equation I'm going to show you. The idea is that we incorporate uncertainty because there's a lot that we don't know, and that we have adaptive management. So adaptive management is this idea that we don't know a lot. We collect data, we learn something from it, and we update what we do for management. And so we have this continuous process by which we get better at actually managing the wildlife. And so the model that we had is actually a pretty simple one on the surface, right? The fatalities of eagles that we expect are dependent on the eagle's exposure to the wind farm, which we define as their use of the space. So how many kind of eagle minutes do they spend flying in a volumetric area? The hazardous space-time of the wind facility. So this is basically saying, how long do we expect the turbines to be running? And for eagles, we only care about sunrise to sunset. So what does that look like within a year? How big are the turbines, right? And how many are there, right? So that's going to kind of describe the hazardous footprint. And then what's the probability that an eagle will collide with an operating turbine? And so if we know how the hazardous space is, we can multiply that by the eagle use of that space and then the probability of collision to get the number of fatalities. Within the model, however, right, we want to incorporate uncertainty. So the idea is that this exposure has a measure of uncertainty to it. So I have a number, but I have the number because I measure data in 2 years. It doesn't mean it's the data in the 3rd year or the 5th year or the 10th year. So we actually just find a distribution of what that eagle's use might look like. And here you can see that most eagles have very limited use of a space, right? Only about 1 to 2 minutes per hour per kilometer cubed, but right, long tail out to about 8 minutes. And we've done this for both species together and golden and bald eagles separately. For our collision probability, right, we again have a distribution. It's a very, very small. We're basically looking at what's the probability of collision per minute. It's really, really tiny. It's like 0.5% chance, less than that, of colliding with a turbine for every minute of exposure. But we, again, have this distribution that says it's really likely to be really small, but it could get bigger. And so we can incorporate the uncertainty that we have into our predictions of the fatalities. And what this looks like then is there's 3 ways we can do it. So that's one of the neat things about this particular approach. If a facility comes to us and has no data whatsoever, we can multiply distributions together. So all we have is this measure of uncertainty from the country and the details of the facility specifically, and we can get the distribution that's on the far left, which says, in this case, we think the most likely number of eagles to die is 0, but could go out to as much as 5. Our solid line is the mean. Our dashed line is the 80th quantile. So that means that 20% of the data is above that line. And that's the point at which the Fish and Wildlife Service permits a facility, right? Because the idea is that there's only an 80% chance, that there's only a 20% chance that you're going to kill more than that. So it's meant to be very conservative. One of the things we want to do with this is predict eagle fatalities prior to construction, right? So we don't have information on actual fatalities yet, but we can collect data on their use of the site. So if we incorporate that data into our prediction, we get the middle plot, right? And so here we're saying, okay, we now know not only how much hazardous space-time we have, but how eagles use the spot. And so now we get, again, another distribution of the possible number of eagle deaths, which now goes from about 0 to 40, right? But our 80th quantile is around 12. So we would permit them to take 12 eagles, provided that they somehow mitigate for those 12 eagles elsewhere. Once you have data after construction, so this is where the adaptive management comes in, we can incorporate that information as well, and then we get the plot on your far right, which again has a smaller range, now only about 0 to 15, with the 80th quantile about 7. So that as we gain more information, we have greater certainty and can make better management decisions. And all of this is done in a Bayesian framework. For our bats, they're another kettle of fish altogether. There's lots and lots and lots of endangered bats. A lot of variation in behavior, a lot of variation in risk factors, a lot of things we just don't know because bats are hard to study. And so the focus here has actually really been on operational adjustments to the wind turbines. And there's two types that they look at. So deterrence altogether. So I'm going to change the structure of my turbine such that bats don't want to get close. I'm going to look at the environmental factors of where I put the turbine. So example of structural might be painting the blades, the type of light that's used at the top to keep planes from colliding with it. You know, there's some concern that some species are attracted to it. So those are some of the structural components. For curtailment, this basically means that we're not going to start operating the turbines as soon as they can. So you need a certain minimum wind speed for the turbines to start spinning. Curtailment means you basically start spinning at a higher speed than the minimum that is required. And this is because bats are known to be more active at lower wind speeds. So if you're not operating at lower wind speeds, you're going to hit less bats. Blanket curtailment in the US generally means that turbines do not operate when wind speeds are below 6 meters per second. There's some variation in that, but it's usually around there. The idea of smart curtailment is that you only limit operation when you know bats are going to be at greater risk. And this is a lot of the interest in this idea of smart curtailment is that blanket curtailment means we're not operating when we could be generating power. So we're getting less power, and as a company, we're making less money. And so I worked on a project where we built a bat fatality risk model. And the idea was to say bat activity is a function of the environment. And we modeled this with what's known as a generalized additive mix model. The bat fatalities are a function of activity. So that was our generalized linear model. And using that information, we could optimize a set of curtailment rules through a simulation study. So when we're operating a turbine, right, we can't necessarily at the exact moment know ahead of time, right, how many are going to die or what the activities may be. So what we're trying to do in this case is say, we know that it's the bat activity that makes a turbine dangerous. We're not necessarily going to be able to observe that, but we can observe the environment. And so we built a model that says if all we know is the environment and what we want to get at is fatalities, we want to skip the activity in the middle. That was kind of the optimization. That was field season 1. If anybody wants to know more about this particular study, I have never actually worked on a study where more things went wrong in both seasons. To give you an idea of like one of the things that went horribly wrong, the land was leased to different farmers. One of the farmers decided that they didn't want us on their land and so started crop dusting the survey teams that were going out to collect data on fatalities. So we had to drop that turbine from the study. So this was one where it was a beautifully designed, proper study, randomized control, really, really nice. And it turned into one of those that was just like a complete shit show because of things completely outside of our control. And I suspicion that that is an experience that many of us have had. Yeah, there's some fascinating things that went on with this one. But so season 2, we implemented those curtailment rules. And it was a randomized controlled block design. Again, it was analyzed with a generalized linear mix model. And we wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of the smart curtailment compared to the blanket curtailment, compared to a control where you just ran operations as usual. And we wanted to evaluate power loss. And so that's actually the plot that you've got up here. So the black line that goes horizontal, if the blue line crosses that, there's no evidence of a difference. If it's to your right, it means that the one on top had less power than the one on the bottom. So what we basically see is that smart curtailment and regular curtailment had equal levels of power loss. We couldn't tell the difference between them, but both are, sorry, I flipped it when I described it, but both our curtailment and our smart curtailment had less power output than our control, which was to be expected. Basically, our conclusion from this was we got pretty damn close, right? If it was the same as blanket curtailment when everything went wrong, maybe when everything goes right, it might be good. So we should look at this closer. All right, on to our last one so that we've got time for questions. So the last bit I want to talk about is animal movement. And animal movement is really fascinating because technology has changed so quickly. So a lot of the original ideas of putting tags on animals were asking questions of like, where do they go? Once we were looking at, are they really there? You know, some of the early tags had dolphins in like the center of islands. We know that's not possible. And then it grew into what are they doing? And so there's a lot of different tools that contributed to this. And the example that we're going to use is one of fulmars and boats. So here we have their central place foragers. So here we have their island where they're found in our little fulmar. And they go out to the ocean. Yeah, I actually used this during my job talk, by the way, to get my current position. It was great. So they go out and we have a recorder on our fulmar and we track its path. And the original idea of a lot of animal movement is those areas that I've circled in green are what we might refer to as area restricted search. It's probably where they're foraging. And the other areas are where they're transiting. And these are the two things that we would try and look at. But one of the things that have become, again, more interesting within ecology is this idea of hierarchical movement, where movement patterns happen within broader scale movement patterns. And so what we actually modeled was this idea that you have a state where you're moving away from the colony, a state where you're moving back towards the colony, and then also a state where you're moving towards an attractant. So a boat, or in this case, the Millennium Falcon. And we fit this using what's known as a hidden Markov model. And these are a discrete case of a state space model. I incorrectly often use those two terms interchangeably. But the idea is that there's some hidden state that we're interested in, such as moving away from the colony, that moves through time. And what we actually can see are data, right? That's our circle, our blue state. We can observe that, but we're really interested in what's in the square down below. And so for our fulmars, right, what we were interested in is, are they moving away from the colony, towards the colony, or towards a boat? That's one set of states. And another set of states are they foraging or are they transiting? And the data we had to inform this are the distance from the closest attractor, right? So, oh no, that does not show up on the screen. So distance to boat, the bearing, right? Which way was the bird facing? And how big was the step length? So how far did they travel in a time step? And we could use this to estimate, right, where the animal was, what it was doing, and its overall state during that time period. So upper left, right, we have, is our bird heading out towards sea? Is it heading back towards the colony? Or is it heading towards a boat? On the upper right, we have what mode they were in. Were they transiting? Were they just moving? Or were they foraging? And one of the things that you can see, which is really neat, is that the yellow dots on the right plot are where we've got foraging, the area restricted search taking place. And if you compare that to the plot on the left, that's often when they're around boats, right? And so why are they attracted to boats? Well, fishing boats discard the fish they don't want, and the fulmars eat them. So you get a lot of this area restricted search behavior around boats. And so even when you need to get back to the colony, you come across a boat and you stop because it's tasty, right? And so this is one of the things that we were looking at. And then the bottom plot is this idea of what's the probability of moving from one state to the other. So what's the probability of switching to heading towards the colony from one of my other states, right? What's the probability of switching to being attracted from a boat from the other states, so that we can get this idea of how is the bird likely to behave. And this can help us inform decision and policy, right? Boat discards when it comes to fisheries are a really big deal. This is off the coast of Scotland, right? Discards, bycatch, it's something that often gets discussed. People often want to limit it. If what we're seeing is that these fulmars really depend on boat discards, does that change your viewpoint of it, right? I can't answer that. I have no idea, but I'm sure some of you in this room probably could. All right, so that brings me kind of to the wrap up of the talk, which is that, right, ecology, as I've defined it, is understanding a relationship between organisms and their environment. Statistics, I actually haven't really defined prior to this point, but one way we can look at it is collection, organization, analysis, interpretation, and presentation of data. And to be fair, I feel like most people, when they think of statistics, start with analysis and end at analysis. And that's actually deeply incorrect, right? If how we collect the data, how we organize the data, define in a lot of ways what analysis I can do, right? How I collect the data should actually also be dependent on the research question that I'm asking. And then if I do the analysis, but I can't interpret it, what the hell was the point of doing the analysis? And then if I can't present it to you all in a way that you understand, again, what was the point of everything prior to it? So to me, statistics really does require all of the different components. And statistical ecology is bringing balance to the two, right? It's not easy, it's not fast, but it's something that's really, really important in terms of where we want to go as a community interested in understanding, protecting, and conserving our environment. And with that, I thank you for your time. I will add that this is not me. This is my friend Dave. We were at the Elmwood Park Zoo in Philadelphia doing a intergalactic day at the zoo. I volunteer with the 501st Legion, which is a international Star Wars cosplay group that makes movie accurate costumes to support local communities and charities. If you are interested at any point in having someone in movie accurate costumes at an event, the local branch is called Cloud City. There's lots of very fun people.
Thank you so very much. That was very entertaining and very educational all at the same time, which is awesome. All right, so we're going to open up to questions. We're going to start with any questions online. Okay, so for folks online, if you have any questions for our speaker, please put them in. For folks in the room, if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand.
Right, so I either bored you all that badly or stumped you all that badly.
Oh, I really liked your point near the beginning that we train students to do a t-test, and then the next week we just throw them out and say, okay, now do the Bayesian hierarchical modeling with your data set. I see this phenomenon all the time. What is your recommendation? Like, what's the better way to do it that would fit into the time constraints of a program?
So I personally think there needs to be more integration of the statistics and many of the other skills directly into the biology classes, and in a way that makes it contextual as opposed to just something to do. So like I think about my biology lab where we did chi-square tests, and I had no idea what we were doing, right? We were given an equation and told to plug numbers into it, and then if the number you got out was bigger than that number, it was good. If it was less than that number, it was bad, right? Like that was it. I remember being deeply confused. You did it, you put it on the lab, and you got it right or you got it wrong, but there was no context of why we should be doing it. And I think weaving that context into the biology and into the ecology classes gives students a reason to care. I mean, that's why I ended up liking it, was because suddenly I had a class that put all the math and stats into the context that I cared about. And then I was interested to learn more. And I think that's how we do it, is that it requires more in terms of the labs, more collaboration sometimes. So like at my current institution, I'm working with the biology department where we're creating like an introductory R lab that students can take alongside their introstat classes, so that when the biologists start using R in their labs, the students are more ready for it. And so then they can talk more about the concepts and how it links to biology in their class, rather than teaching students, what an error message means. And so that allows, within the context, they had to take the stat class anyway. You add a 1-credit lab, it's not that big of a difference, but they can learn a lot more in their actual biology class.
Other questions in the room? All right, 1 second. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. I'd ask like you to, this question is more for the students here, but can you recommend that the introductory and advanced levels textbooks in statistics and geometry?
I mean, it's tough because I do think that there's actually a gap in textbooks. And I've talked with two friends for years about trying to fill this gap, but none of us have time to write a textbook where the introductory textbooks, there's a lot of very good ones out there. The one I currently teach out of is Tintle et al. And takes a very simulation and hands-on based approach that I really like because I feel, again, that the hands-on learning is a better path to understanding it. But then there's this big gap, and then you hit the advanced books. And the advanced books assume that actually there's a lot of knowledge in between that is actually very rarely taught. And again, my own experience, I went from many of those introductory classes to some more advanced ones where they use terms like maximum likelihood, like I should just know what it was. And it's never talked about in the earlier classes because that might scare me. And that gap is one that needs filling. Which books are the best, I do think very much depends on context, in that like one of the books that I often like, although it's now out of date, is a book by Zur et al. I call it the penguin book because it's got penguins leaping off, and I see all the ecologists nodding. It's a book that was written by statisticians for ecologists and hits the right tone of you're intelligent people who are capable of figuring things out, but you've not had the training, and we're going to give you some of that. And so it doesn't, there's still some pieces that assumes you know, but it doesn't skip big steps going, and then clearly, but if you're not an ecologist, then every example is baked into ecology. And so then the context is gone. There's a number of really excellent fisheries books that I like if that's people's interests. Alan Agresti does a number of really excellent social studies focused ones. And so that's kind of where I would recommend people look, is within their field, what is the textbook that will give you the most context? Because if you just go with like what a statistician thinks is a well-written textbook, it may not be of any interest to the folks here. And then you're bored because what do I care about world economy? I mean, I do care, but yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Thanks, Jessica.
Not to flog this horse or anything, but if it's so unsustainable and ineffective, why is it stayed this way for so long? In terms of training, if
So
it's,
I missed the first part of the question.
if it's so unsustainable and ineffective, I'm just curious your thoughts on why academia has kind of gotten stuck in this mode of sort of failing our students and then ourselves, I guess.
I mean, so again, I'm basing it on my experience. It's not obviously going to be the experience for everyone. And my experience has been that some of it is we need to keep enrollments high, right? Like, what does the college want? The college wants to be financially viable. That means we only support majors that support themselves. And so that means high student enrollment, and students are scared of maths. And so they don't want to have a high quantitative component immediately apparent in their program, because then students don't sign up for it. And then their enrollment drops and they're not seen as relevant, and they're at risk of being shut down or merged with another department. And again, I'm not saying that that's the only thing. I think another major component is there is a ton to learn in ecology, right? And so how many credits can you require for a major? Many schools have a limit, right? And so how do you decide the trade-off between teaching the statistics and teaching something else? And it's a value judgment. And I think it's also a judgment of where do most of our students want to go? If most of your students want to go into policy, then what you need is a course on how do you understand statistics that somebody else has done for you, not a class that teaches you how to do statistics yourself, right? And so if you've got a program that does that, but then if you're somebody who changes your mind later, right, what do you have? And so I think that that's where a lot of it comes from, is these kind of competing needs to be relevant to your institution, whatever that means, to not try and overwhelm the students. And then also, many of us made our careers without needing statistics, so why do my students need it? Right? And I think from the statistician standpoint, I think that also becomes a problem where, if particularly at larger institutions where you have very separate departments, right? One of the things I like being at a smaller one is that like we all talk every day. There's only like 120 faculty members. So there's no strangers unless you want there to be. But if I'm just at a stats department and I'm just at an ecology department and my stats department specializes in business statistics, right? I don't want my students taking that class. And then the business statisticians are saying that they require econometrics. And you're like, why do I want my students to take that? It doesn't make any sense. So there's also a negative push from stats departments where, oh, well, the only way you can take applied regression is if you also have linear algebra, calculus 3, and stat 1 and stat 2. And again, so you're going to have 5 classes, so your students can take the one you're actually interested in having them do. It doesn't work. And so there needs to be that balance component as well. And I think that works better at either smaller schools or schools where you have researchers who are overlapping with the ecology, fisheries, biology type of research.
All right, we're gonna take one more question.
So yeah, building off of that, I've had a number of students that needed statistical help that I didn't think I could provide to them. So we said, okay, let's go make an appointment at the stats departments. They have open hours or office hours you can book. And they've gone and come back very disappointed. They look at our data and say, yeah, it's too messy. You can't do this. It's worthless. Or, you know, go collect another 10 years of data and come back. Or they don't understand the question we're trying to do, or there's such a communication disconnect at multiple levels there. And I wonder if you have any advice to us or the students about how to communicate more effectively to those statisticians to get them to help us better.
Yeah, well, I mean, so one, I'll say you can always send them to me. Yeah. So I think there, some of it is you're learning to express just how good your data are in context, right? Because I do think that that's often what's missed, is that there is no such thing as 10 more years. There is no such thing as like making the whale stay still so you can get an exact measurement, that this is what we have. And that within my field, this is considered the top tier. Making them understand that this is not something that's impossible. It's just because you're used to working with, say, medical data, right? Here's a long literature of where people have done related things. It might be helpful if it's possible to say, okay, based on the existing literature, what I think my student needs to do is a GAM, right? Can you go to them and say, okay, what I need help with is understanding these error messages with the GAM, or understanding some of the limitations. So there may be ways to focus the conversation more, because I do think that one of the things that happens when you approach statisticians who are not working whatever field it is, right? Whether they're an economist or you're an economist and the other person does ecology, right? You're familiar with what your field does. But if you can limit it to things that are perhaps a little bit more general, to the idea of what do we need with statistics, or what is the broad question? So, okay, I want to learn something about these 5 response variables together. I think I might need multivariate statistics. Could you tell me about multivariate in this broad context? And that might help the kind of advisors understand a little bit more about what's going on, because as you drill down, it does get very, very specific, and it is hard to see sometimes if all I know is X, it's very hard to see what you do with Y.
Thank you for that. We're going to transition here just really quick back to our students. We have a little gift for you, and we want to hand that to you.
We do. We have a certificate of
Aw.
recognition for being our student speaker. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you.
And can I ask all the students in the room after I'm done talking to come to the stage, and we'll take a photo with Leslie. But I have one more announcement. If you have now, after listening to Leslie talk, if you have discovered her genius and you're like, darn, I didn't book an appointment with Leslie, she still has some openings in her schedule for tomorrow. So, you know, if you have that stats question that you haven't been able to figure out, or that model that won't run,
Or you just want to talk Star Wars?
yeah, or that, you can just shoot me an email and we can try and figure something out for tomorrow. But yeah, one more round of applause for Leslie.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.